Next.js is generally unopinionated on how you should handle data in your application. And from a junior's perspective, there's nothing more difficult than learning a framework that's unopinionated. You simply just don't have the skills that are required to come up with solutions on your own. You need help through examples, guidelines, and opinions. So in today's video, I really want to summarize everything I've learned about data handling in a Next.js production website, which I've been working on for the past 4 months full time. So this is an application I'm building that is supposed to replace a native Java application that users actually download to their computer. And the basic idea is that you can select between different projects which are connected to different databases. And when you have a project selected, all of these mini applications you see here perform different actions on that database. So for example, if I choose this test one, then these apps become available, and you can, for example, view documents related to that database. And here you're going to get into this kind of mini app, which is the document viewer, which loads documents from a different virtual machine, for example. All right, so let's go over all the ways that we can actually use data in a Next.js application, right? So the most common way that we fetch data in a Next.js application is on the server. So we have, for example, first point being fetching data on the server from a database. So let me zoom in here a little bit. So that's the first one. This is the most common situation. You're on an asynchronous server component, and because you're on the server, you already have direct contact to the database, so you can interact with it immediately. So that's kind of the first one, I would say. The second one would be fetching data on the client. So fetching data on the client. And here we kind of have two different use cases. So fetching data on the client, some components depend on data. And so whenever the data changes, the component should synchronize with that data change because there's a bidirectional dependency. So the component depends on the data, and whenever the data changes, the component should change. So this is when you use libraries like SWR and TanStack query to create a dependency. That's something I've found so far. So that's one situation where you want to fetch data on the client. And a second situation is not necessarily when there's a dependency. So the component doesn't depend on data, but it has local state, which means it has to be a client component. And that state is important for the query. So you can't fetch it on the server because we don't know what the state is yet. The user has to interact with inputs and buttons and text fields that creates the state. And then when the user is ready, they submit it, and it sends a request to some database or some service. So that is more fetching data on the client with a trigger. So when the user is done with an action, they can trigger some kind of asynchronous function which fetches data. So that more or less covers fetching, but what about mutating data? So again, if you're mutating data on the server, then it's pretty easy. So since you're already on the server, you already have access to the database, and you can just query it directly inside of your asynchronous component. And in a bit, I will show examples of how we do all of this in actual code. But for now, if you're on the server, you know how it looks. If you've used Next.js, you can just directly query the database right there in the component. But if you're on the client, so mutating data on the client, then you most probably want to use Next.js's server actions. So server actions are the easiest way that from a client submitting a form or pressing a button, you can trigger a form action, which is basically a function that is going to run on the server. I've made 2 or 3 videos about server actions because they're so often used in Next.js on my YouTube channel. So if you still want to check those out, or if you want to have a better understanding of how they work, check those videos out. But in general, it's pretty simple. It just triggers code on the server, which has access to the database, and that's how you mutate data from the client. All right, so let's take a look at some of this in an actual project using some actual code to explain how I handle all of these situations and my opinions on how you should do it as well. So this is a Next.js project that I just created in half an hour. It uses shadcn for the components. And if you guys want a quick tip on how to make shadcn components look a bit more unique, you can check out this website called tweakcn. And it basically lets you select between 40 different themes that all have different color palettes, different fonts, different button sizing, and roundness. So for example, one of them that I like, or not this one, Solar Dusk. It's just a bit of a more unique shadcn customization library. And if you select one of these kind of presets, you can also change them by adjusting the colors and the borders and all of those things. So check it out. It definitely makes your projects feel more unique, and it only takes 5 minutes to quickly change the theme. So that's one tip that I also learned while working full-time on this project. But yeah, I hope you guys find that useful. Let's get back to the example. So in this component, we have the client part of the component, which is this form. So obviously this needs to be on the client because there's interaction, right? We're filling out a form that requires user input. That can't be done on the server. And then we have a create post button. This is going to use a server action, we'll show that in a bit, to create a new post and save it to the database. And here is then the server part of this component, which just gets all of our posts and sends it or renders it along with everything else. So let's show exactly how this part is done. So here we have our suspense. So this is basically just showing as the posts are loading, it's going to show like the skeleton. So if you save, you see you get these like skeleton things, which lets the user just a bit of a better experience. And in the actual posts lists, this is where we have our asynchronous component. So if it's an asynchronous component, you know right away that it's on the server, because only server components can be asynchronous. And the reason why it's asynchronous is because it is waiting data before it can render the component. So it is using this get post with author. So this is going to be later in order to show how to handle errors in this kind of situation. But what this does is it just queries the database to get posts that are related to an author. It's pretty simple. It uses Drizzle ORM to select those posts. But if you go to the actual Next.js docs, and in the server components, Next.js doesn't say anything about how to handle errors, because when you're fetching from an ORM, which is here, let's say you're using Drizzle, there is always a chance of an unexpected error happening. You can always break the connection between the server and the database. That's always a possibility. And I think it's a bit weird that Next.js doesn't actually say anything about that, besides in this like error handling section, which is kind of relevant, but basically my point is that this can fail at any time. And at the moment, if we show what that would look like, if we set the simulate DB error to true, and we go back to the query, we can see here if basically I have this environment variable set to true, it's going to throw an error instead of actually getting the data. So this is like to simulate an unexpected error. And now when we get the posts, we're going to get an error here, but it's not like handled in any way. So now in this case, if I'm refreshing the page, I get this like really ugly, and if you're a user, like you have no idea what this means, like application error or server side exception has occurred. So this is one situation where you need to handle errors even when you're on a server component. And the way that you want to do that is by having an error file. So if you add this error.tsx file at the root of your project, you basically catch any unexpected errors. And this is the way I would recommend, or this is my opinionated way of how you should handle all unexpected server errors. So it would be very awkward if every time you want to fetch data on the server, you wrap it with a try and catch and handle the error there. The reason being is that these errors almost never happen, but they're always possible. So you do want to have one kind of catch all in case it happens, have a nice UI to show the user, but you don't want to increase the number of lines of code and kind of create like a try catch every single time you do this, because those errors almost never happen. But now the experience is way better, right? If we refresh, then this error gets thrown here. Where was it? In the actual get post with author, the error gets thrown here, and then it's never caught anywhere. So it bubbles up all the way to the root component of the project, and the error.tsx file here catches that error and displays like a custom UI fallback, which looks something like this. And now as a user, it's way more enjoyable, right? You can see something went wrong. Okay, we're having trouble. There's database connection. You can try again. You can go home. You can refresh the page. All right, so that covers point 1 on our list, actually fetching data on the server from a database. And now I actually want to go all the way to the end, which is mutating data on the client using server actions. So the reason is these are 2 easy things to do with Next.js. It's provided in the framework. We don't need any additional libraries, so it's good to get those out of the way. So let's actually change this to false. Now this database URL that I'm leaking here, it will be deleted by the time the video is uploaded, so you guys can't use it. And now that we've set that to true, we can just get our dashboard page again, and let's quickly go over through this, how I do my server actions, because I actually was doing that wrong for a long time. And the way I would advise or give my opinion, so again, creating this like Next.js opinionated way of doing server actions, is to always use the useActionState hook provided by React. So this useActionState hook, you have to use it quite a few times to get the hang of it, but basically you're just passing in your action that you create in your actions file, and it returns a new action which you can pass to the form. But the main difference is you actually get this variable is pending back for free. So you don't have to create internal component state that tracks whether something is submitting, and then when it's done submitting, set the variable again to false. Like, it just comes with the hook. So that's nice. And you can also get this data back from the useActionState. So it's called state, but it basically is just the data returned by the form action, which in this case we don't use because we're just creating a post. But let's say you were filling out this form and people left out this field, you could, in the server action, like validate that, realize that they didn't fill out this field, and send back like a message saying you need to fill out the required fields. So that's what you can use this state variable for, which is any data you want to return from the form action. So yeah, this is how I would advise you to use server actions. Just always do it like this. Create your server action, pass it to useActionState, pass this to the form, and use this to track whether something is submitting. So you can, for example, disable buttons or set loading state. Okay, so let's take a look at our final examples, which are where it gets a bit more complicated because we have to start using or leveraging libraries that are outside of Next.js. So fetching data on the client. React and Next.js provides a fetch function which you can use to fetch data on the client, but the problem with that is much the same as when you try to do it on your own with server actions. You end up having to create custom hooks which manage the same things over and over again. For example, tracking whether the state is submitting, tracking any errors that happen. Maybe you want to add custom functionality to cancel the request if it takes too long, all those things. And caching, for example. And those are the things that you generally don't want to do every single time for yourself. So you bring in a library. And the library that I want to talk about and what I found to be useful is SWR. So SWR, I think I already have it open. It is a very lightweight. It provides basically only the minimum functionality that is required to build a fetching library that is useful. So it has all those features that I just talked about. And if we quickly look to the data fetching, what I was talking about is exactly this thing. You can call the hook and you get back data, error, and also an is pending or is submitting variable. Just here they don't show it. So it is in the background basically a use effect hook, I imagine, but it handles all of these variables for you. So that's the nice part about them. And if we go back to our example, I've now created a new tab that just queries random quotes from this public API that you can use. And let me tell you, this is where things like AI are getting crazy efficient. Like, I can build this page in order to create a quality YouTube video for you guys in 10 minutes. And that's just a game changer, because if I would have had to make this from scratch without AI in the past, it would have taken me at least an hour or two, just because it's so many lines of code. And AI just like spits that out. And because I've done it before, I know that it's quality instead of just AI slop. But this is a page that AI generated that lets you see random quotes from an API. It lets you change how many quotes you want to see. and it lets you add tags to the API, so you get quotes that are related to a specific topic. Now, why do I want to show this? This is because now we need to fetch data on the client. So it depends on state that the user decides. So how many quotes do they want to see? The server can't know that because it requires user interaction. And how SWR works is it treats this as like a conditional dependency on the data. So whenever the data changes, it automatically remakes a request. So you can see if I change the number of quotes to 4, it automatically makes a new request. And if I quickly show how that's done, again, this isn't going to be a YouTube video about how SWR works, but more about to make you aware of the different options you have and my opinion on how you should use them. But SWR requires every query to have like this fetcher wrapper, which basically just wraps the fetch function and handles some error. So this is the fetcher function, and every time we make a request, we use this function basically. And so now you can see we use the useSWR hook to basically give the API and that wrapper function I just talked about, and what you get in return is loading the error and the data. So again, 6 lines of code and everything complicated about caching, errors, loading state, it's all handled for you. So I would use SWR as the library to fetch data on the client whenever it is a dependency. So literally the definition is when a component is dependent on data, whenever the data changes, update the component. But that's not always the case. And I spent a long time trying to figure out this one edge case, which was, what if you need client-side interaction? So for example, selecting different tags, but you only want to trigger the fetch or the query when the user actually submits a button. So it's not a dependency in the same sense that this is a dependency. Whenever you click one of these buttons, you automatically want to change the data that it's fetching because it's dependent on this button. But in this case, it's not fully dependent because you want to wait. You want to trigger it in a sense. You want to trigger it when a button is clicked, when a form is submitted. And this is an edge case which I haven't found like well described on the Next.js docs, in the React query documentation, and even in the library that I'm using. They haven't really discussed this case, even though I think it happens quite often. And the way that you want to do that is by using this useSWRMutation hook. And the reason why it's nice is it passes you a trigger. And this trigger you can use whenever someone presses a button. And it's going to actually trigger the API endpoint with like a custom function that you can pass to it. So here I just join the tags with this comma separator, which is kind of like how the API expects it. And then I make the fetch request with the tags and then the limit that's set here. And you can see here also whenever I leave the page for too long and I come back, the framework is automatically revalidating the data. So that's another benefit that why you want to use this client-side fetching library. So that's kind of it for this video. In this, we covered fetching data on the server from a database. So basically the default way and how to handle errors in between there. Then we covered server actions and kind of my tip on how to use the useActionState hook. Then fetching data on the client, my recommendation is using the SWR library and specifically just use the useSWR hook when you have a dependency, and use the useSWRMutation hook whenever you want to get a trigger and kind of create or make a query whenever something changes or a user clicks on a button. And mutating data on the server, we didn't really cover, but it's basically the same thing as fetching data on the server. You are on a server component, so you have access to the database, so just do whatever you want to do. That's the beauty of being on the server. And yeah, I think this has hopefully helped everyone find something useful in the video, since it covers everything related to data fetching and mutating in the Next.js application.